Hi, my name's Jessica, and this is the story of how I escaped domestic violence while battling my addiction. So, at the age of 3, I was kidnapped from my mother, and it is the earliest memory that I have. I've asked my father in adulthood why it happened, and the best answer that I can get is I was angry. I remember telling her goodbye that morning, and then we were gone. And by gone, I mean in a completely different state, hundreds of miles away. When I was 7, my dad got remarried. Her name was Linda, and she seemed great. She was loving and she was caring. But what I didn't know was that she had lost her children to sexual deviation, which in the late 80s, early 90s, that was having sex with your own children. By the time we moved in with them, her boys were teenagers. And remembering correctly, they were 13 and 15. Every time I went into that fort, it was with her boys. And every time I went in there, I was assaulted. And it wasn't bad enough that it was just her boys, it was her. By 8, I was being stood in front of a full-length mirror, completely nude, and told that this is what pretty girls do. So by 8, I had a very good understanding that I was a pretty girl and that I was going to make men happy, and I could do that with my physical body. We eventually moved away, but my dad didn't leave her because his children were being hurt, and he didn't leave her because he saw changes that were happening within us. He left her because she cheated. And to be perfectly honest, if not for that, we would probably still be there. So by the time I was 12, alcohol was something that I needed. It wasn't a want. It wasn't something that was fun. It was a need for me to function with normal people in normal society. Something as simple as going to school, I had to be under the influence. Whenever I say that I was different, and I always knew that, when I was using substances, the way I would always explain it is that my very loud brain became very, very quiet, and I could function and I could think. I got great grades in school. I was almost a straight A student. I didn't become sexually active again until I was a teenager. But once I did, I never looked back. And no one ever talked to me about how abuse can actually manifest in something called hypersexuality. I became extremely promiscuous. I didn't care who I hopped into bed with. And as a result, I got pregnant at 17. I was supposed to graduate high school early. I had been accepted into college, and I had a whole plan. I was going to be a lawyer. I was going to work in my uncle's law firm, and life was going to be fantastic. And I dropped out of school, and I focused on what was going to come next, which where I was living at the time was marriage and family. My son was born while I was still 17. And as soon as I turned 18, I got married. And I became all about my husband and my son. There was nothing else important to me until I found out that my husband was having an affair with a woman that he worked with. What was controlled because I stopped drinking while I was pregnant, had no desire to use it again once I had my son, spiraled out of control. And now I had another resurfaced addiction, and I had a problem. And where can those two things come together for a, very, young adult? Where could she be successful and still be able to maintain those addictions? I became an exotic dancer, became a stripper, because that's what I could do. I called a friend after I had taken the pills. And even though I was angry at her for a really long time, she did the best thing that she possibly could have done, and she called my dad at work. He came home, called 911, and I ended up in the ICU. And as he said that I needed to be taught a lesson, because what kind of mother would do that with her son in the home? And so to teach me a lesson, he sent my son hundreds of miles away with his dad. And so I called somebody who I thought was a very good friend of mine. Turned out he was not so great of a friend. He knew that I danced and we would party together because he was an addict just like I was. So I went to stay with him. And so when my friend looked at me while we were at a party and said, "Hey, I got to run home. I'll be back in a couple of minutes. You stay here." I listened. I wanted to go with him. I said, "No, just take me with you." He said, "No, I'll be right back. Jess, I'll be right back. It'll be fine. I'll be right back." But he didn't come back. He didn't come back for over a week. But the couple that owned the house, it only took them 5 minutes to let me know that I had been sold. That I had been sold for $35 worth of and that was all it took to sell me, my body, my person, my brain. I was a sex slave. I was a house slave. I was a nanny. And then I met him. Then I met Nick. And Nick was the very first person that ever looked at me like I was a person. That was always the first thing that people noticed about me, was that I was beautiful, or that I was pretty, or that I was hot, that I was a stripper. It was all of those things. But he talked to me and he had conversations with me. And that very first time that we went out, he looked at me and said, "I'm never taking you back to that house." And now my first initial thought was, where am I going to live? Like, I have to go back there. I've got nowhere to live. He said, "No, you're going to live with me." We had been seeing each other for about a month. And he got me a phone. He made sure that I could keep in contact with my son. And it was about the happiest that I'd ever been. He went to work one day and I was cleaning the house and listening to music. And I got a call from my son's stepmom, who told me, "You know what, Jess? I'm done with this, and we're done with you, and we're done with him. So you've got 24 hours to get down here and get him, or we're going to take him to the state and we're going to tell him that you abandoned him and he can be a foster kid." And that man, who had only known me for a month, who rescued me from trafficking, took me 651 miles away to Southern Illinois to get my son on his dime. So I had moved in with Nick, and my son and Nick and I were finally living together. And then we started to get into little arguments. Nick and I would start to bicker. And probably the biggest issue was that I had caught him talking to other girls on his phone. Once I started questioning my worth again, it all went downhill from there. We lived in an apartment that had a huge staircase outside and a balcony porch. And it was probably a good 30 feet up in the air. And Nick passed out in his boxers on the porch. He was that intoxicated. And I got my son to sleep, woke him up. And I'm just, "Hey, wake up." And he woke up and he punched me. He hit me with so much force that my body flew backwards and I almost went over the railing of that balcony. My mom did what every mother would probably do, and she called the police, who came immediately, and they saw my face and they took him right to jail. I went and bailed him out of jail. When we got home, he looked at me and said, "I'm going to marry you." I can reflect back on that situation and say, oh, all the red flags there. He was just waving them like I should have seen all of that. So I tolerated the abuse for over a decade. I was married to Nick for just about 12 years. And I found out that I was pregnant. And then I really knew that I wasn't going to leave. And it was while I was pregnant that I ended up diagnosed with stage 3 ovarian cancer. Right as our son was being born, our daughter was passing. I was pregnant with twins, and my daughter passed while I was still pregnant. So the lifelong addict in me once again said, "Oh, yay, substance. Okay, I can deal with life." And you would think a baby being born is this, amazingly happy experience, but it really wasn't, because our life, my life, Nick's life, my oldest son's life, our new baby's life, Everything rapidly and radically changed overnight. Nick had got hurt at work. We lost everything. We lost our house. We lost the car. We lost it all. Burned through our savings. The one regret that I ever have is where we moved, and that was in with Nick's mom. Seemingly overnight, my husband that just, was talking to other women, occasionally seeing other women, turned extremely violently abusive to not just me, but my oldest son. He got violent with both of us. And it wasn't bad that it was just him, but it was his mother. And it was her boyfriend. And it was their son. It was an entire family. It took years before I was finally able to go. It took 3 attempts on my life, one which put me in a coma and on life support. It took him throwing me down the stairs, an entire flight of stairs, in which our youngest son was sitting at the dining room table. My youngest son still can tell you exactly what he was wearing and exactly what he was eating. I lost my oldest son. And when I say I lost him, I mean, I gave him up. I could not watch Nick put hands on him anymore. I could not watch my own life destroy him anymore. And the straw that finally broke the camel's back, it was November of 2020. By November of 2020, I had lived in a car in his mother's driveway for 8 months, while he and my son lived in his mother's house. And I'd finally started voluntarily trafficking myself again, because that was the only way that I was able to get money to support the addiction so that I could take care of my son, so that I could be a mom. I spent 2 weeks in a dual diagnosis unit for mental health and addiction. That was the very first time that I'd ever been really, truly diagnosed with mental illness. I was diagnosed with bipolar 2, obsessive compulsive disorder, panic disorder, borderline personality disorder, and very complex post-traumatic stress disorder. I think one of the most amazing things that has happened as a result of all of the trauma and all of the chaos and all of the abuse and all of it, it sort of culminated last year when I got a phone call that I was nominated for a Survivor of the Year award, which is a national award. It's for the Purple Ribbon Awards. It's like the Grammys of the domestic violence community. They nominate shelters and advocates, and there's different categories, but their most coveted award is their Survivor of the Year award. And that is reserved for a person who has essentially, against all odds, made it out of the impossible, overcame immense challenges, immense struggles, and now has turned their life around to offer positive, impactful, and innovative service back into the domestic violence community. Thank you for listening to my story. And if you want to follow along, if you want to be part of the Surviving Beauty movement, or if you just want to follow me along on social media to see what kind of crazy antics I get into next, you can follow me. The links are down below.